Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, in most elections, everything comes back to money, which is why questions are always asked about costings. If anything, this election so far has been about Brexit, and it's as though the deficit, which dominated for so many years, has largely been forgotten. So the well-regarded and independent Institute for Fiscal Studies has published a reality check today, helpfully telling us everything about it and what it is that the last two parliaments have done or not done to it. It covers the deficit, taxes and spending. So what's the story? Chris Cook has been delving inside the IFS report.
One topic was central to the last two general elections.
We will halve the deficit over the next 4 years.
As we reduce the deficit, our country is facing the largest budget deficit in modern history.
And you can expect it to recur in this one.
We need a credible plan for dealing with the deficit.
Despite a rather different context.
We will clear the deficit as soon as possible.
The financial crisis and associated recession increased the deficit to its highest level since the Second World War back in 2009-10. The deficit's generally been falling since, and it's now back to the level it was at before the crisis, a bit above our long-run average, but not high by historical standards. So there's a case for more deficit reduction, not least because we've racked up a lot of debt over recent years, but we've not got a deficit that's so large it's extraordinary or out of normal bounds of what you would normally see.
The deficit now stands at about 3% of national output. That's a bit high, but less than the deficits in France, the US or Japan. It's also a lot more than the deficits in Germany or Ireland. And that permanent memento of the crisis, our debt burden, stands at more than 80% of output. That's still smaller than the US or France or Japan, but again, way ahead of Germany or Ireland. Since 2010, there have been some things that haven't been restrained from growing, like pensions. There are also things that have been relatively shielded, like the NHS. And there are some things that have been boosted, like international development. Overall, though, there has been a major spending squeeze. After the financial crisis, spending rose to a peak of around 45% of output. Since then, it's been squeezed down to its pre-crisis level of just under 40%. Now, tax receipts have, in recent years, just started to creep up. But it's spending cuts that have done most of the work in closing the deficit. The fiscal problem for the government is that we are 7 years into this austerity drive, and the low-hanging fruit has already been plucked. It's hard to see how the NHS is genuinely going to stay within its budget trajectory for the next few years. It's already miles off its targets. Schools are planning to lay off lots and lots of teachers to get through the next budget round. And the prison system is creaking. Austerity is just a lot harder than it used to be.
Doing spending cuts in a painless way is difficult and will become more difficult over time. The waste, the low-value programmes are likely to be already eliminated. And in fact, if we look at the last general election, the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron was adamant the government could take 1% a year out of public spending for the first 2 years. Look at the data now and it shows actually spending rose in those 2 years. So instead of taking £15 billion out, they've added £23 billion to spending.
Our 6 pledges.
That's why the Tories have now drifted into line with what were actually Ed Miliband's spending plans. Now, the Tories attacked Labour in 2015 for planning to spend more, and we can expect a reprise of that argument this time around. But if the Conservatives still want to close the deficit by the end of the next Parliament, they need to find another £15 billion in tax hikes or spending cuts. And all the easy spending cuts are gone.
Chris Cook there. Well, let's analyse all of that. Chris Philp is a Conservative MP on the Treasury Select Committee. Mariana Mazzucato is Professor in Economics, the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at UCL, and sat on the Labour Party's Economic Advisory Committee. Thanks for coming in, both of you. Chris, why did the Tories implement Ed Miliband's manifesto during the Parliament that's just finishing?
Well, the Conservatives did what was fiscally responsible. We've taken down Labour's deficit from 10 or 11% of GDP down to 3% today.
That's not the question.
And
So the question was, why have you implemented Ed Miliband's rather than your own goals?
Well, to be honest,
set at the last. It's only 2 years. You went into that campaign with a lot of promises. You're about to come into this one. You're going to attack the Labour Party on the same grounds. I'm just asking why you implemented their policy than your policy.
Well,
we now know that's what you did.
I don't think Labour even had the first intention of implementing that policy. Every single measure
Doesn't
we've
matter.
taken...
You've implemented their policy.
Every
Why?
single measure we've taken in this Parliament to get the deficit under control successfully was opposed by the Labour Party. Every single measure. And the fact we've got the deficit down from a peak of 10% to 3% of GDP in quite difficult economic circumstances is an incredible achievement. By difficult economic circumstances, I mean the turbulence in the Eurozone, our biggest export market.
I'm talking about the last 2 years.
In China.
We've had an election since the turbulence in the Eurozone. We elected you on the basis of a manifesto and the basis of the criticisms you made of Ed Miliband, and you have implemented the Ed Miliband fiscal strategy. At the time, many people said your fiscal plans lacked credibility. You said, trust us, we can do it. We now know, we've got it from the IFS, you couldn't, and you delivered the Ed Miliband plan.
Well, what is true...
Public spending has increased, hasn't it, rather than decreased?
Well, public spending in real terms has been constant at about £760 billion a year.
It's increased by about 1% a year. You said you'd reduce it by about 1%
your own chart showed it reducing from 46% of GDP down to about 38% of GDP. And in real terms, in real pound terms, it's been constant at about £760 billion a year for the last few years. The figures you're quoting are only the departmental expenditure limits. They don't include all government expenditure.
It would be ridiculous for the voters to listen to anything you have to say about Labour's tax and spending plans, given what we've just learned about the last election and what you said about Labour's plans, which you then went on to implement.
Nonsense. We've reduced Labour's deficit from 11% of GDP to 3% of GDP.
You keep repeating
well, it's an important figure. It's an important figure.
You keep repeating it. I'm saying what happened at the last election was you made a lot of criticisms of Ed Miliband's plans, and then you delivered them.
Look, what is true?
Why would we believe you if you'd made new criticisms of Labour Party plans, because you might implement those?
So what is true is that it has taken longer than we thought. So we hoped originally, going back to 2010, we could eliminate the deficit by 2015. So it has taken, you're quite right, it has taken longer than we expected, but it's heading strongly in the right direction. And every single measure we've taken, the Labour Party is opposed. So there is only one party fighting this election with credibility, and it's the Conservative Party.
Mariana, I've spent a bit of time with Chris Philp because I think a lot of those issues come out of what the IFS has said today. Does the deficit still need attention? Should getting the deficit down, it is higher than our average, historical average, the debt to GDP ratio is high. Should getting the deficit down be a goal of the next government?
First, just a correction. The deficit was not an average 10% or 11% under Labour. Governments around the world after the financial crisis basically saved the capitalist system. Counter-cyclical stimulus obviously costs money. You're picking a particular number that was during a year right after the financial crisis.
That's what we inherited.
There was 1 year when government saved the capitalist system. Anyway, deficits matter, but what matters is what you're actually spending on. So, you know, the figures you just showed before are incredibly telling. Italy's deficit today is lower than the UK's deficit. You know, how much does that tell us? Italy's deficit has been lower than Germany's deficit for the last 20 years.
They borrowed a lot in the past. They accumulated a big pile of debt.
What matters is how you are growing. So what really matters, and what both parties should be talking about, and are not talking about, is the big elephant in the room, which is that the source of growth in this country continues to be private debt, consumption-led growth, not investment-led growth. So the ratio of private debt, not public debt, to disposable income is back at record levels as it was before the crisis.
If we made you Chancellor and you were on the Advisory Council for Labour, what would your fiscal target be? What would you say? Would you say we should be getting 4% of GDP, 3%, or you just say, I'm not even going to look at that number? The number's always going to be there.
But did you learn anything from the Excel sheet problem of Reinert and Rogoff when they obsessed on the number of 90, right? This terrible number that as soon as a country's debt to GDP went over 90, all hell would break loose. That was found to be completely irrelevant. There's plenty of countries with lower than 90%, higher than 90%. It doesn't tell us much about the long-run growth.
What I'm getting from what you're saying is that the kind of spending...
If you don't have a plan for the country...
Next question. Is spending more on the police, spending more on welfare, spending more on all the things that we know the Labour Party would like to spend more money on, is that the kind of spending that gives you... or is that not the kind of spending that gives you the long-term growth?
Well, First of all, you need long-term growth. How do you achieve it? You want a plan for the country, whether that's, Germany's energy event policy, which if you look at what they're doing, it's not just capital expenditure, it's not just innovation and infrastructure, it's also a particular type of, spend that you could call, consumption spending, trying to change demand, for example. Norway. Why are 30% of Tesla cars being sold in Norway? Because they're actually focusing on a particular type of consumption. So this false dilemma, should we spend on nurses or infrastructure?
You see, I think a lot of people will worry if they hear you saying, well, it's a false question if you look at the...
No, but Evan, your data that you showed before shows that it's a false question. Right. There's plenty of extremely weak countries that have low debt to GDP ratios. What does that tell you?
Last one to you each. Do you think in this election campaign this is going to be much of an issue, or do you think this election campaign, we've just moved off and we're going to talk about Brexit, relations with Europe and the like? Chris?
Well, I think it will be an issue because the Labour Party are making promises, we saw it today with Diane Abbott, which cost lots of money to pay for, and they've got no idea how to pay for it. Whereas the Conservatives will be responsible, we have been responsible, we'll continue that, and the more irresponsible, unfunded promises we hear from Labour to be paid for by our children.
So you're going to make an issue.
It's going to be an issue.
Go on, you have a last word, Marianne.
Economic policy has reduced how much we're spending on education. Is massacring. No. Why are head teachers all over the country protesting? Are they foolish? Do they have no idea what's happening to the school system?
We know it's going down.
Do you not
Let's
trust
not
what
argue
head
about it. We know it's going down per pupil.
Yeah, but the point is, productivity continues to lag. The little increase in real incomes has gone all to over 60-year-olds. That is a problem. We have an increasingly financialized economy. Again, personal debt to disposable income is back at record levels. How can you call that achievement?
And we need to leave it there. I'm so sorry, Chris. You've had... No, we really do need... Thank you both. We're going to have plenty of this over the next few weeks.